translation there, or the actual word there, is Sheol, but it's often translated as the grave. Sheol can mean a couple different things, and you see it translated a few different ways throughout the Bible. But basically it means the place where the dead rest. So in the New Testament, they use the Greek word Hades, and they translate it that way. It's just the place where the dead go after they die. So a lot of times it's translated as the grave, but the original Hebrew word there is Sheol. So just in case you're ever running across that somewhere else in the Bible, it might translate it as the netherworld or Hades or the place of the dead or the grave. All those to mean the same thing. It's just when I die, this is where I go. So another thing I wanted to call out there. Job has a lot of good Hebrew that we can dig into, and so I really like that part of it. But like I said, he's just continuing to go on through this hopelessness here. So any other thoughts on those verses 7 to 11 before we move on? All right. Verse 12, he says, "Am I the sea or the sea monster that you set a guard over me? If I say my couch will comfort me, my bed will ease my complaint, then you frighten me with dreams and terrify me by visions, so that my soul would choose suffocation, death, rather than my pains." So again, some interesting Hebrew here, and for this one, I actually have a slide because I think that this will help us out a little bit. So in verse 12, if you're looking at the actual Hebrew here, Job verse 12 translates it a couple different ways depending on what book or what translation you're using. So the one that I'm using, the New American Standard, says, "Am I the sea or the sea monster that you set a guard over me?" King James says, "Am I a sea or a whale that thou settest a watch over me?" And the New King James Version says, "Am I a sea or a sea serpent that you set a guard over me?" So can you spot the difference there? Each one of those is translating a word differently. One says sea monster, one says whale, one says sea serpent. So which is it? Right? Now the original Hebrew word here that they're trying to translate is tan, or the plural is tannin. And this word can mean several things, including dragons, serpents, whales, and jackals. So depending on how it's being used, it can mean any one of those four things. Okay? It can mean any one of those depending on how it's used. You really have to use your context clues to figure out which word, which translation it's actually using. So now, if you are a Bible scholar, pretend that you're a Bible scholar, and you diligently want to translate the Bible as accurately as possible for the future generations, right? And so you've got your original Hebrew, and you're reading through it, and you're trying to translate that to English, and you read, and it says, "Am I a sea or a blank that you set a guard over me?" And you see this word tannin there. Am I a sea or tannin that you set a guard over me? And you say, okay, well, what's tannin? Well, I know it can mean one of these four things, but which one is it? How would you know? You just have your context clues, right? And that's the trouble with some Hebrew words, is that without enough context, it's difficult to translate. And that's where, especially in some of these poetic books or some of the prophets, you see this in Isaiah as well, where it's difficult to translate a word because there's just not a lot of context around it. Now, it's talking about the sea, so you can probably rule out the word jackal, right? You don't see too many desert foxes like swimming in the ocean, right? So it's probably not jackal. We can probably rule that out, right? The most likely ones are probably a whale or a sea serpent, right? The idea that is really being conveyed in Job 7 verse 12 here is the idea that Job is saying, am I some dangerous force of nature that you have to be so watchful of me? That's what he's going for. That's the idea that he's going for, is I'm just a human. I'm just this small, insignificant person. Why are you so watchful of me? I'm not some big, dangerous thing that needs to be overseen, right? That's the idea that Job is going for. And so in that context, we can see that one of these other translations probably fits best. But exactly which one, you could probably debate that till the end of time, right? And it's not the only time that that word tannin has that situation. I found a couple others that I thought it was interesting. So here's just 3 examples, 3 different verses in the Bible where that same Hebrew word gets translated a different way according to which version of the Bible that you're reading. So you can see that in Lamentations 4 verses 3, 2 of the versions, the New American Standard and the New King James, they both say jackal, but the King James says sea monsters. In Psalms 74 and verse 13, one says sea monster, one says sea serpent, and one says dragon. It just depends on the context. And usually it's kind of like the verse that we were reading in Job, where the idea is roughly the same. You know, it's saying some big dangerous animal, and that's the idea. You know, that's the idea that it's going for. But it's just neat to see that depending on the Bible version that you're reading, they can translate it different ways. And it's good to be aware of why that sometimes happens in case someone asks you a question about that. You know, and they say, oh, well, you know, what if the Bible's mistranslated? What if people get things wrong? How can you follow a book like that? You don't know. People make problems all the time when they translate things. So we can't trust anything the Bible says because it was translated by people, right? Because people in the world are always looking for ways to discredit the Bible. So having an understanding of why situations like this arise is helpful for us to know. And interesting, I think the weirdest one here is Lamentations. You can kind of say, well, jackals and sea monsters don't seem to have much in common there. Why would you think one over the other? Well, if you look at that, it's talking about, you know, even tannin nurse their babies, right? So it's saying that even a dangerous animal still has some compassion for its baby, right? And so in that case, you can see that really any one of those could work. A whale would work, a sea serpent would work, a jackal would work. And the reason I think that more people chose jackal in that situation is because the verse before and the verse after are also talking about some other more land animals and desert animals. They talk about an ostrich, and there's a couple others, things like that, which is why I think that the translators went with jackal in that situation. But because of the vagueness of the Hebrew word and the lack of context, the translators have to do the best that they can. So I wanted to point that out because that's one of those things that when we want to dive deep into the Bible and really understand the meat of what we're studying and understand why things can pop up this way, it helps us to be better and more knowledgeable when we have to talk to someone who's outside the church when we're translating things. And I can share those verses with you later if you didn't get a chance to write them down. Matt.
It's interesting in that Lamentations verse to think about whales are mammals. We think of them as great fish or something, but they're actually mammals, which are defined by nursing their young. And so
exactly.
Yeah, but nobody translates the whale there in that particular verse.
In that particular verse, no. I think that there are some other versions of the Bible that do translate it whale. They're just some of the less commonly used ones. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting to just see the different ways that the word tannin can be used. And there are plenty more than that. I just chose 3 as examples for this. There are plenty more, though, where tannin is used in the Bible. Okay, so we'll close that for now, and we'll continue back into Job here. So after verse 12, he had been talking about the fact that when he tries to get rest, he's getting no rest. He had said that, when he lays down, in verse 14, he says, "Then you," talking about God, "you frighten me with dreams and terrify me by visions." This is pretty strong accusations to level against God, don't you think? It's almost as if he's calling God a bully here. Like, you just won't let me rest. And Job says in verse 15 that death would be preferable to what he's enduring. Continuing into verse 16, he says, "I waste away. I will not live forever. Leave me alone, for my days are only a breath. What is man that you exalt him, and that you are concerned about him, that you examine him every morning and put him to the test every moment?" Again, this is pretty strong accusations here. He says, that God is putting man to the test every day. He's saying that he wants God to leave him alone in verse 16. Now, I don't think that Job doesn't want anything to do with God. I think he just wants the suffering to stop, the trials to stop. Addie?
Well, I've seen and heard people, even this day and age, when you're suffering so much, you blame God. You got to blame something or someone for the suffering you're going through. So a lot of people will blame God.
Yeah.
Because he's the one that we look at as the Father that can stop this.
Yeah.
And when it goes on and on, we blame the one that we hold responsible.
Yeah. And it's really interesting that that happens, because here in Job we see what's actually occurring that Job doesn't understand, right? It's that Satan is testing him. But it's interesting that Job's not blaming Satan at all.
You never do blame Satan. You seem to blame God.
Yeah.
He's the one that would help us.
And that happens in the world, right?
Yeah.
The world in general, while it might not know a whole lot about the Bible, it understands that in the Bible there's God and there's Satan, right? There's God who is pure good, and we know that Satan is evil, right? And yet, the world would want to blame God for all their problems rather than Satan, which is a really weird thing when you think about it. Now, if they look at things closer, if you question someone on that, they might even tell you, well, isn't God ultimately in control? So even if Satan's testing me, it's because God allowed it, right? Which is funny because, again, it reveals that they deep down understand a truth that God is still in control of everything, right? And here, Job understands that God is in control of everything, but he's still asking that God stop testing him, although he's kind of doing it in a rather accusatory way. Now, we'll see when God steps in, he answers Job's accusations, right? And I wouldn't want to be in Job's shoes at that point. But that's coming up. But it is a common thing, like Addie said. And we run into that where, people want to blame God for everything. Jim, did you have your hand?
Well, we need to look at the Apostle Paul and the thorn in the flesh that he had. And
Yeah.
he asked it to be taken away. But there was a reason God was allowing that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And it, Paul actually became stronger through the
Yeah.
So this is what's happening to Job.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting that you bring up Paul, because I think in Paul's case, it's very similar in that they both want a test or a trial to stop, right? But I think that the way that Paul approaches it is much more the way that we would envision it, right? Because Paul is going and he's entreating God. He knows God's in control. He understands that. He understands God has the power to stop that trial. And he's asking him, can you please take this away? Can that be done? Whereas with Job, it almost seems more like, no, stop, leave me alone. It's more accusing. It's more forceful that way, is what it seems like. And it's hard to tell with tone, when we're reading the Bible, but that's just the way it seems from what we're reading here. But either way, there's nothing wrong with entreating God and asking him for something to go away. He certainly has that power, and we do see that at the end of Job, Job is praised for going to God with his troubles and his concerns. So that part, that is a good thing. But as we've said multiple times before, it's good for us to remember Job's state of mind right now. He's a very troubled person because of all that he's gone through. And so he's probably not thinking clearly. He just really does want all the pain to just stop. Any way he can have that happen. Any other thoughts or anything before we continue on? Okay. So in verse 19 he says, "Will you never turn your gaze away from me, nor leave me alone until I swallow my spittle?" Verse 20 he says, "Have I sinned? What have I done to you, watcher of mankind? Why have you made me your target, so that I am a burden to myself? Why then do you not forgive my wrongdoing and take away my guilt? For I will lie down in the dust, and you will search for me, but I will no longer exist." Now there's one verse in particular here that I think is really important to look at, and that's verse 20. And the reason for that is, if you are reading the New American Standard, or if you're reading the New King James, Job says, "Have I sinned?" as a question. If you're reading the King James Version, what does it say? It says, "I have sinned," right? Now that really changes the context of what you're reading here, right? So which do you think it is? Matt?
I'm just going to add more chaos to it. The English Standard Version says, "If I sin."
And that one says, "If I sinned." Yeah. So what is Job saying? Is he saying, "Have I sinned?" Is he saying, "If I've sinned"? Or is he saying, "I have sinned"? What do you think?
Well, I think that we all sin.
Right? We all sin.
So Job, in his lifetime, sometime, has sinned.
Right? So in that translation,
Man is not perfect. Only God and Jesus
Right.
are perfect.
so in the King James Version, if Job is saying, "I have sinned," he's kind of thinking towards Romans 3, right? Like, all people have sinned, right? Matt?
So if you think of this broader context of this whole argument, there's the whole thing with God and Satan and, this whole thing that we can't see or that Job can't see. But then Job's friends are accusing him of sinning.
Right?
And that's why you're having all these problems. But Job is saying, well no. And of course, we know from the whole beginning that wasn't the case. So,
Right.
So I'm not trying to suggest that Job never has sinned or whatever, but this isn't about Job's sin. That's not why
Right.
he's struggling. So maybe from that perspective, maybe why the New American Standard is asking it as a question: Have I sinned? What's going on? That's Job wants to know what's going on.
Right. So if it's one of those questions, you could say, if we're translating it off of the ones that say, "Have I sinned?" right? All of Job's friends, like Matt was saying, are saying, "We think you sinned, and that's why you're suffering all this." So Job, in this context, could be saying, "Did I actually do something? Was there something that I did and I didn't realize it? If so, let's bring that to a conclusion," right?
Well, the next part of the verse says, "What have I done to you?"
Mm-hmm.
It's,
And there's also the fact that,
what have I done to you?
Right.
Passing.
he's saying, what have I done, right? So you could look at it that way. And then for the ones that translate it, "If I've sinned," again, if I've done anything wrong, can't you forgive me of my wrongdoing and take away my guilt? So there's 3 possible ways that you could think about this, with different Bible translations backing those up. So I think what's helpful is what Matt suggested, is looking at this book as a whole. From the beginning of Job's complaints, from the beginning of his lamentation, all the way through to where God jumps in, Job is proclaiming his innocence, right? Because his friends keep saying, "You did something wrong," and Job's saying, "No, I haven't. So I don't understand why this is happening to me," right? So we have to take that continuous message into account. And we have other verses to back that up, that Job keeps saying he's innocent, right? Now, towards the New King James Version, there are a couple other verses where Job is commenting on something that Eliphaz or Bildad said, where he says, I understand that no human is perfect. He makes the remark that he understands that, which is kind of what we read in Romans 3. That idea that no one is perfect, no one is sinless. And we understand that, but we also know that Job is a righteous and a blameless person, right? Because we're told that by the Bible at the very beginning. So we see that as well. Ultimately, I think that you can read that a couple different ways, because I don't think that any of those translations are wrong. And what I mean by that is, if you think about Job saying, have I sinned? You know, he's saying like, look, I don't understand what's causing this because I think I'm innocent. Right? If you read it as, if I have sinned, again, that's still Job thinking, look, I don't know what I did wrong. I've done nothing wrong. If there's something that I'm unaware of, again, resolve me of that. Let's end that. And if he's saying, I have sinned, in the idea of everybody sins, then also let's resolve that. So I think that no matter which one you go with, it will actually work. And ultimately, it's still the fact that on a high level, Job is confused about the suffering that he's enduring. Job doesn't understand. Did I sin? Is this just a result of regular being a human kind of sinfulness? What's going on? Why am I suffering the things that I'm suffering? He's not just saying, oh, Eliphaz is right, and, you know, I messed up. It was that thing I did last week. Let me fix that. We can see that it's not that. We're out of time. We might pick up and review that part again because I think we were having a good discussion on that. So we might pick up there again next week. But in the meantime, go ahead and reread the end of chapter 7, and you can start reading into chapter 8. Thanks, everyone.